Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. The election is over, and now comes the fun part, analyzing. And helping us do that with some of the Northwest races and nationally is Washington State University political science professor Travis Ridout. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Ridout.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we're going to get into some nitty gritty, but first let's just look at some of the wide picture. 2020, in your field of study, what was it like? Was it basically unprecedented, or was it basically same stuff, different year, cranked up to 11?
I think more the latter than the former. One thing I study is political advertising, and there was more political advertising this year than any past presidential campaign before. And that started in the primary races with Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer spending multi-millions, hundreds of millions on advertising, and continued through the general election. The Biden campaign almost had more money than it could spend at the end of the race. And if you lived in Tampa or Phoenix, just about every ad you saw on television would have been a political ad.
I'm interested in what political scientists such as yourself might call the incumbent's advantage. We all like a good underdog story, David versus Goliath and those sorts of things. But in reality, how advantageous is it for an incumbent to win re-election?
Yeah, generally there is an incumbent advantage. Generally, it's a pretty big incumbent advantage, though that depends on the race. We think the lower down the ballot, the larger the incumbent advantage is. And there are a few explanations for this incumbent advantage. One is just name recognition. We tend not to vote for people that we've never heard of before. And that incumbent we've generally heard of before because they've won, because they get that media coverage. There's also kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy. Donors expect incumbents are going to win, so they give them money. And thus incumbents generally have more money to spend than the challengers. Oftentimes, especially with a state legislative race, it'll be an uncontested race, or there'll just be a token candidate. And so incumbents in those situations can win by huge margins. All this said, there's also some evidence that that incumbency advantage is declining at the national level, say in races for Senate or for the US House. And that's because we're more polarized than we used to be. There used to be Democrats who on occasion would vote for a Republican and vice versa. And those types of individuals have almost disappeared.
All right, well, I'm glad you bring that up because that segues into what I really wanted to ask about locally in the Congressional District number 5 in Eastern Washington. Of course, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, longtime incumbent, has been there since 2004 and won re-election pretty handily, I might say, in a year that was expected to have pretty good turnout for Democrats. And in Whitman County, especially, that is a county that, of course, has gone for Hillary Clinton in 2016, Joe Biden this year, and voted for Jay Inslee in both of those years. It's the only Eastern Washington county to do so, of course, and that has a lot to do with the presence of Washington State University and Pullman, having that sort of voting demographic. However, even though Whitman County went for Biden and Clinton in 2016 and this year, and Inslee, they voted for Cathy McMorris Rodgers, which is interesting. So there is some ticket splitting going on right there. So I wonder from a political science perspective, how you might attribute that. Is that one, the incumbent's advantage playing out right there because she's been there for quite a long time? Two, just her specific policy positions in particular, regardless of her incumbency, is just attractive to the types of voters in Whitman County. Or three, perhaps the person running at a higher level for president was just relatively unpopular and she is more popular. Is there anything like that going on?
Well, yeah, perhaps all of the above. But I think by and large, that difference you're seeing is an incumbency advantage. The fact that McMorris Rodgers did a lot better in Whitman County than did Jay Inslee, for instance, or Lauren Culp, the Republican nominee for governor. And, you know, we've all heard of Cathy McMorris Rodgers living in this area. She's been in Congress for a very long time now, whereas few have actually heard of her Democratic opponent, Dave Wilson. He wasn't able to raise a lot of money, and so he wasn't able to spend a lot on advertising and get his name out there. And so, you know, again, people aren't going to vote for people that they've never heard of before. And it's also just the fact that this congressional district is, you know, there are a lot more Republicans living in the 5th District of Washington than there are Democrats living in the 5th District of Washington. That may not be true in Whitman County, but the district taken as a whole is a Republican district. So that in itself, I think, helps to explain McMorris Rodgers' popularity and her pretty big win this year.
Right, and we would be remiss not to note that perhaps one of the biggest congressional upsets ever happened in the 5th District in 1994 when incumbent Speaker of the House Tom Foley lost re-election during the Republican Revolution to George Nethercutt, of course, part of the revolution that year. It was the first sitting speaker to lose re-election in, what was it, over 100 years or something like that?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Right. So obviously incumbency doesn't mean everything in the 5th District, but obviously that was 26 years ago, a different district than it was then. So let's move on. I'm curious about Washington State as a whole in terms of the role the governor's position plays in state politics and how it might be possible for a Republican to win statewide. It's no secret that Republicans are having a harder and harder time winning statewide office in Washington State. Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State, is now going to be the only statewide elected Republican. And so it's going on now 40 years since the governor was a Republican in Washington State. And then perhaps in Idaho, of course, the opposite is true for Democrats winning statewide. So it is not uncommon, though, for states that tend to elect one party or another for for president, tend to also, though, have a governor of the opposing party. I'm thinking even of California. It's not so long ago that Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course, was elected there. But other states, Massachusetts, Maryland, Maine, often might have Republicans for governor, but they typically vote for Democrats for president. Opposite maybe for North Carolina and Kentucky now have Democratic governors. So my question is, what's maybe different or unique about the electorate in Washington State or even Idaho, where that's not so easy, but in other places like in the Midwest or the East Coast, that's more common?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that we vote for a governor in Washington the same time we vote for a president. And thus, there may be some almost presidential coattails there. People tend to link those votes, whereas it might be less so if we voted in a midterm election year. So those national trends matter. I do think a Republican could win governor in Washington, but it would take, first of all, a pretty moderate nominee. And the Republican Party of Washington, as they've lost kind of legislative seats in those suburban districts around Seattle, it's become a much more conservative party. And that's been reflected in their nominee this year, Lauren Culp from Eastern Washington, and not the type of moderate that you probably need to win statewide. I think the other thing you'd need to see for a Republican to win in Washington is some sort of political scandal or political crisis coming out of Olympia, where people are saying, we really need some change. Things are not going well in this state. And I think the Democrats have been lucky over the past few elections in that there hasn't been a crisis. And so people have, in general, voted their partisanship. And we could probably paint a similar story for the state of Idaho as well, why it's been very difficult for Democrats to win in that state.
You also study political advertising, and I'm going to venture to guess that there's less money in studying it than there is in creating or broadcasting it. But this year, of course, as you mentioned earlier, just astronomical sums of money being spent. I wonder, though, outside of that amount, is this year in the way political advertising is done in any way new or unique, or is it pretty much, again, just same stuff, different year, and a ton more money?
Well, you're right. The big story this year is a lot more money than any other presidential race. But there are some differences. One difference is that a greater percentage of that ad spending is going to digital advertising. So ads that we see on websites or on social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube. And so, although some people suggest that a lot of that spending is actually going to raising money that is used to buy political ads on television. A few other differences this year, it's actually, believe it or not, less negative than in the past few elections. And we also saw a huge Democratic advantage in terms of ad spending just across the board in House races, Senate races, the presidential races. And while Democrats had an advantage in ad spending in 2012 and 2016 in the presidential race, it just wasn't to this extent. So we've seen these big partisan inequities there in ad spending.
You noted earlier about, presidential election years helping a governor running in the same year. So that's maybe explains some of why Washington State is, consistently electing Democrats, because they're helped by the presidential race. I wonder, though, I know the data will be crunched for some time, coming out of this election, but is this sort of a high watermark year in terms of turnout and enthusiasm for Democrats in the state, or Republicans in the state, or perhaps nationwide, or is it really too soon to tell?
Well, I think we've definitely seen record turnout this year, the highest voter turnout in at least 50 years, maybe 80 years, who knows once the final numbers are all tallied, but definitely high voter turnout. And I think the big question for me right now is whether this is kind of a Trump phenomenon. Is there something fundamentally different about politics with Donald Trump on the ballot, his ability to draw this turnout, to make Republicans come out and Democrats come out and vote? Or would we have seen this high turnout if there were, say, a generic Republican on the ballot with the same state of the economy and so forth? I'm not sure. More broadly, I don't think we can return to a politics of the 1950s, for instance, but I think the big question for me is whether 2024 and the presidential election will look like 2020 on steroids, or it'll go back to maybe something that we've seen in the past, more like 2012 with perhaps some more generic candidates who don't draw the level of love and anger that Donald Trump draws.
Well, we all hope for some sort of a breather and not to be talking too much about the 2024 presidential election before the 2021 is all sorted out. Good information. Thanks for joining us today to talk about it, Dr. Ridout.
Thanks for having me.
You can see more election news and Northwest news at our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.